I do think taxidermy appeals to people perhaps who don't have any time for conceptual art, and they like to see the work that's gone into it, and maybe just to be reassured that they couldn't do that themselves. I mean, I like to think my work kind of combines both of those. It can be conceptual and have that craft too. Parrot. I'm just looking for something specific right now. This is a gannet. A lady in Liverpool sent me. She found it on the beach. To start with, when I first began doing taxidermy, I was so overawed by the animals themselves that I would get inspiration from just looking at a bird or something, and it was a much more instinctive thing. So I'd walk around with a bird, and I'd put it on things and in things, and I'd sort of just see the way it moved and the colours, and I'd sort of just kind of I'd handle it for a day or something, I suppose, and start to kind of get a feel for how I think it might look good, or what elements I could juxtapose it with to make it, to sort of bring out the beauty in it. This piece I'm going to make will be a scrunched up bit of paper, so like the kind of discarding of an idea. I'm going to cast the paper in, I think, in plaster or jesmonite, so it'll look like a ball of paper, and it's going to have a broken pencil, again, something that you do when you're maddened by your inability to work. A broken pencil, but in the shape of a lightning bolt, so it's going to come out of this scrunched up bit of paper, which will represent the cloud. It's the cloud hanging over everything, which is sort of how I've been feeling lately. Every time I think of something, the next day I'll wake up and decide it's not good enough. So I've had this kind of cloud hanging over me, and that's going to be represented with a scrunched up ball of paper. And then the lightning flash will be made of a broken pencil, and it's going to be penetrating the breast of the bird. I'm actually thinking now, though, putting this bird next to these, I'm wondering if the bird's maybe a little bit too big for this piece. I might have to try and find something a bit smaller. I wonder whether this might be a slightly better bird. This is a minor bird. I'm going to go and look at this now. Might be a little smaller. Yeah, great. I'm going to use this one.
So tell me why that pleases you more.
It's just a slightly better size than the other one. This one, to me, just looks a little bit too big. It's only a fractional difference, but it changes things for me. It's all about balance, really. When I'm making stuff, everything, it's a difficult thing to explain, but everything just needs to balance, right? And I feel like that does. One of my first works, right in the beginning, I was just walking around my flat in my studio with this dead rat. It was a very fleshy, very floppy thing. I really like these old-fashioned champagne glasses, and I bought one from an antique shop. And I put it inside, and it fitted so nicely. It sort of spilled out slightly on the edges, and it looked like this sort of scoop of fairy ice cream. And there was something very sort of surrealist about it, and it just looked really beautiful. And I really, it was that thing I talk about with balance. It just sort of balanced. and it was bought by Vanessa Branson. I installed it at her house next to a Grayson Perry vase, and I just sort of thought, like, what the, this is crazy. I couldn't quite believe that someone who bought things like that was buying my work. So I'm basically disconnecting the top layer of skin with all the feathers rooted in from the body, which I do by making small cuts and sort of peeling it with my fingers. I think taxidermy has for a long time been about the display of the animal, and that's it really, and everything else has been secondary to that. So the taxidermist would create little kind of worlds and cases and where they'd mimic the natural environment of the animal. And I've never sought to do that in my work at all. The animals, I suppose, have been used more to convey an idea or an atmosphere, or to create humour, for a number of reasons, but not my sort of modus operandi has never been just to show the animal as it is in life. Just make sure the balloon actually sits straight, because sometimes it needs a bit of tweaking. I've always wanted to bring taxidermy up to date, I suppose, and almost get away, even though I use the domes and everything, I've kind of wanted to get away from the Victoriana that it's associated with and make it sort of more modern and more sort of pop, I suppose. And I found that obviously the balloon is a very sort of pop image. And I thought there was something very sort of poignant and touching really about the sight of this little bird that had never matured going up in a balloon. There was something sort of womb-like about the balloon and the string and the umbilical cord, and I couldn't really get away from what it reminded me of. Well, very often when people look at my work, certainly if they're just sort of not thinking deeply about it, they think it's about death because I've used dead animals. But I would say to that a charcoal drawing isn't about dead because it's made out of dead wood, dead burnt wood. I think that it is a material like any other, and I think it can be used to convey all kinds of meanings really, and it's very literal to look at it and just assume that the artist is talking about death. Sometimes I am. I'm not saying that I don't in my work. It does happen, but that's not the only thing. And mostly, actually, I think my work's more about life and about the sort of triumph of life over death. And I did a piece of work a few years ago, which was a coffin that was sort of splitting open. It looked really rotten and decrepit, and it had hundreds of tiny, tiny little quail chicks bursting from within with their beaks open, like they wanted to feed. It really kind of overwhelmed me, the sight of them all together. I'd been making all these heads and bodies for ages, just sitting around like doing the same thing every day for months. And suddenly just seeing them all like that on top of each other and around each other, they suddenly had the impact that I'd hoped they'd have. I think just chicks trying to feed, I find personally quite a kind of shocking and alarming image. Any suckling babies, really, they are like parasites, really, and that's all they do. Chicks are just mouths, really. There's very little more to them than the mouth. The mouth is really oversized in relation to the body, and that's all they're about at that point. And there's something very frenzied and terrifying about that sort of need to be fed. The terror really lies in life, not in death, because death is a peaceful state, ultimately. but it's the actual life and the fight for life and the fight to stay alive, which is actually more scary to me. The show that I made this for was called Endless Plains, which is the English translation of Serengeti, which was a place I visited a year or so ago now. Inside what looks like the rib cage of the stag are hundreds of little bats hanging on the ribs, asleep. And I've concealed mirrors inside the stag, either end, so that it looks like it goes on endlessly. I came up with the idea of bats sleeping on the inside of there, because there's something very peaceful, but at the same time there's this sort of potential about bats sleeping. You know that at any minute they could all just sort of come at you. I like the sort of idea of the uncanny and of that sort of doing a double take on something where when your mind plays tricks with you and you sort of, I don't know, you think something is something else, or that weird thing that happens in dreams when you're talking to someone and then suddenly there's someone else and you don't even question it. And I suppose just to create something that feels familiar to you somehow, even though it doesn't exist, is quite pleasing. Hiya.
Hi. You all right?
Yeah. How are you? Have you got my squirrel?
Yes, I have. Not defrosting, hopefully. There you go.
Thank you.
She's quite a big one.
Clawing her way out of the bag.
Yeah, I know.
Wow, that's quite big.
Yeah, she's pretty big, but she's in good condition.
Very
In a
good
kind of
condition.
stunned pose.
She just had a heart attack on the
I don't know where she
pavement.
found it. I think it was just outside this girl's house, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Is that your role then, picking up dead animals?
One
Yes,
of his roles.
one of my many roles, yeah. Delivery, special delivery. More special than the Royal Mail.
I had to check when I was doing interviews for the job. I had to check that the people were comfortable handling dead animals.
It's true. I'm not sure my
Is,
flatmates appreciated it in the freezer last night. I've got to admit, my vegan flatmates.
I decided early on that I wanted to work only with animals that had died natural or unpreventable deaths. Someone sent me a sort of exotic chicken once, which was very odd looking. I couldn't work out what it was for quite a while because it was frozen in a strange position. She's a friend of mine and she's funny. She keeps animals and she lives in the country and she's terrible at warning me, so she'll just send me like a pet, her child's pet rabbit will suddenly arrive in the post one day. Fortunately, I seem to always be in when they arrive, but occasionally. There's a guy who sends me bags of budgies. He breeds budgies and he seems to lose a lot of budgies, but he'll save them over time. And suddenly just post me a massive box of budgies out of the blue, and I have missed his post a few times and had to go and pick up a load of rotten birds from the post office. I try to say yes to everything I'm offered, really, because I never know what I'm going to come up with next and what I'm going to need. And in the past I've turned things down and then a couple of weeks later suddenly thought of something that involved that animal and kicked myself. So as long as there's freezer space for it, I take it. This was a totally unexpected present from a friend a couple of months ago for my birthday. She turned up for dinner in a posh restaurant with it wrapped in bubble wrap and presented it to me. It's a Cape Buffalo. It's incredibly heavy and she's very small, but she's one of the toughest women I've ever met. So she managed to carry it in.
And do you think people see a big bit of taxidermy and they think, oh, Polly would like that?
I guess so, yeah. Yeah, I think people definitely, they either associate me with taxidermy or roadkill. I often get texts from people saying, saw a dead fox today and thought of you. I actually view my work and cooking and meat for cooking very separately, actually, because I did used to think that I might eat the bodies that I remove from birds, because it seems like a bit of a waste just throwing them out. I would be slightly worried existing on roadkill, maybe when I'm a crazy old lady.
Is that your ambition?
Well, I think when I'm on, I will be probably quite a hermit as an old lady, I think. I imagine myself living in the countryside with loads of dogs. I mean, I have a lot of friends in the London art scene, and I like them, and obviously if I'm out, I think the problem is the times people see me pictured represent probably about 2% of my time, which is when I'm invited out to a party or something. So I've made an effort, I've dressed up, and I get there and someone stops to take my picture, and I turn and smile for the camera and look like I'm enjoying myself. And often, I have a nice enough time, but it doesn't mean I really want to be there. And such a small amount of my time, but that's when I get photographed. So that's what people see of me, and sometimes, what worries me a little bit, actually, that's probably what I know that I look in the papers and I see, if I see photos of people at parties all the time, I think, God, do you ever get any work done? David, food's ready. Everywhere I've lived before, I've been the work has taken precedence and the life has been shoved in a corner. Now I've got this really nice, clear delineation between work and life with the two separate floors. And I like to make them look really different as well. One's kind of nice and clean and spacious, and the other's quite cluttered and dusty.
Does it not bother the dogs?
No, well, they're very used to it. I mean, I got him as a puppy. That's his life. They love it when dead animals arrive in the post. They run up to the box and start sniffing it, and I know that something's arrived. No, they're not very interested, really, in what I do. I've tried feeding them the bodies before, but they weren't that bothered. They just sort of played football with them. Made a mess. That's one thing that I find a bit unwelcome, actually, about taxidermy. Sometimes you just can't help find yourself imagining what's under the skin when you're petting an animal. So I'll just sometimes be stroking, cuddling the dogs, and I can visualise what's underneath the skin, because I've done foxes before and they're very similar. And you really, even with humans, I can obviously I've never skinned a human being, but at the same time I can really visualise now how things are put together. And it's great. It's, on the one hand, it's given me a really good understanding of nature and biology, but on the other hand, it does sort of intrude on your daily life sometimes, and it just makes you feel a bit more sort of prone and vulnerable, really. I think you start to realise how fragile you really are. I'd know exactly how to chop my hand off if I needed to, and where to aim for, and it just sort of makes me feel sometimes, well, it reminds me of how fragile we all are, really. So I make an incision at the back of the skull like that, and then across, sort of cut a box in it, and down here. And I cut this here underneath. This part here underneath the jaw. I was very lucky. I got attention pretty quickly, or my work got attention pretty quickly, and I think it really is because the material I chose to use was quite kind of captivating to people. That's the tongue. And on top of it, there weren't that many people, there's not many people doing it, so it's far easier to sort of stand out than it would be if I was painting or if I was a photographer or something, when, you know, photographers and painters are 10 a penny really in East London, and you have to be doing something pretty different with it to get people's attention. So I'm aware of that. I realise that, you know, it's not my genius that has brought me the attention that I've got, but now that I've got it, I think that I have to try and use it wisely. The idea behind Departures was really to sort of create an homage to an inventor that had created a drawing of a flying machine. It was a kind of carriage that the human would sit in, and it would be carried by birds, and in his instance, eagles. There's just something touching, I think, about that human need to fly. It's not, you know, we're earthbound creatures, but yet we sort of want to go deep sea diving. We want to go up in the air, and we want to experience everything, and we sort of have bird envy, I think, a lot of the time. Departures was probably a reflection of the confidence that I was feeling at the time in my work. And also my desire to kind of make things a little bit less ornamental and more monumental. I wanted to see if I could be the sort of artist that commands a space. And I named this piece Foundations Remains because I like the idea that it could be looked at in different ways. It could either be the foundations of a building, of something new, of something beautiful that's springing up, because it almost looks like scaffolding, or like the sort of foundations that you put on a building before it's all sort of assembled. Or it could be the remains of something that's you know, a building that's sprung up and then sort of been allowed to die and rotted almost. They're all crow femurs, so leg bones and the crow. And I made about 20, 30 moulds of them, and then cast out 2,428, I think. And then they're all hand-painted as well.
Which way do you want the shadow?
I don't think it really matters.
I like that shape of that shadow.
I used to take all the photographs of my work myself, but I'm no professional photographer. So I have since had them professionally photographed, almost always by the same girl. Ish. Stop. No, go back a little bit. Yeah, let's try that. Oh, that's nice, actually. You do get a greater sense of the spiral if you look at it on there. I have to let go of it once it's left the studio. I can't follow it around for the rest of its life. So I think it's important to sort of send it on its way as best you can. I have peaks and troughs all the time. You know, I have these crazy highs where I think, wow, everything's going so well, I'm on top of the world, I can do no wrong. And then the next day I'll wake up feeling miserable and thinking, you know, that it's all just a big fluke and everyone's going to wake up to the fact that I'm just a con artist. Which is, you know, obviously not how I feel about myself most of the time, but then you get these moments of just huge confidence crises and you think, what the hell am I doing? Why am I doing this? Who's it for and what's the point? But somehow I am compelled to carry on doing it. I will generally always take on a little bit more work than I think I can do. I'm almost always in a position of feeling like there's not enough hours in the day to do things. So the wire that's come out of my false neck, I've got to glue it into the back of the skull here. And once that's set, I will turn the skin back the right way around again, over the body, over the form. It's quite tricky, this part, because you're trying to get the widest point, the skull, through quite a narrow aperture in the neck. So you can sort of see it starts to take shape at this point, and it's really just a question of pinning things in place, padding things out, bending wires, stitching it up, and modelling the head and giving it a good dry, and it'll look like a bird again. But all of that finishing off is something that you have to be quite fresh for, and I've learned never to do that at the end of a day, because I need patience for it, and I really need to be quite sharp. So I generally, if I've been working on a bird in the day, I'll quite often leave it at this point, come back to it the next morning when I'm feeling a bit fresher. I'm just putting it in my studio freezer alongside a few other bits of food, because I'm too lazy to go into the stock room. If I'm doing something repetitively, I start to sort of dream about it as I'm going to sleep. I often have weird images come to mind as I'm drifting off. I do quite often dream that I'm working on a bird and it comes to life and attacks me.